There it is. Today we'll be reviewing some code from a user named Gleb who submitted it on the our code submission form. Um, Basically, it's Dungeons and Dragons: The Legend of Drizzt. I haven't heard of that. I've played Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not sure what The Legend of Drizzt is. Do you know what that is? It seems
No
to be
idea.
like a popular thing. I don't know. Maybe I just missed that in my D&D sessions. But
Yeah,
basically,
I haven't played D&D in a while. Although I am playing, by the way, major recommendation is what's that game that I'm currently playing? It's really good. It's the one about the detective.
it's like a tabletop game.
No, it's bother me now. Why did I bring it up if I don't remember the name? Disco Elysium. Disco Elysium. Really good game. It's a single player game that is kind of plays out like a D&D campaign. Very clever. Really enjoying it.
Oh, that sounds cool, actually. All right, I'll check it out. All right, shoot. So check that out. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and review this code. So basically, this is some a very simple implementation here. So you hit select adventure. It starts you off with some text and a tile map that gets generated by a couple of XML files. I already looked at some of this ahead of time. And what we're going to be looking at is the game controller, which exists here in the hierarchy. And the game controller is kind of like a state machine. I don't want to go too deep into what it does because we're going to look at the code. There are definitely some things we're going to refactor and look at. But at the end of the day, one of the big things is that this leverage is kind of like a state pattern type logic. So if you look at this, I'm in a hero phase, so I can't do really anything. But I can hit next phase. I'll be in some sort of exploration phase. In the hero phase, I can hit move and attack. As you see, these lit up, so I can hit move, and all of a sudden, this green area lights up, so I can actually move around. And that's just kind of the gist of it. I mean, I haven't really found any monsters yet. I haven't really explored too much. What I have explored is the code. So let's take a look at the code. So basically, we're looking at the game controller, and this, as you may have guessed, controls the game. But sorry, my Google Home just started talking to me. But what I know, did I say something that said hello Google? All right. But basically, one thing that I first noticed, and I'm sure Jason, you have thoughts too. But just the first thing that I noticed was I'm seeing the word controller, and I'm seeing the word view, and I'm seeing a couple other words in here that make me think that this is implementing some sort of variation of MVC, model view controller pattern. So that's just kind of the first thing that we noticed here. Pull up my notes.
And that's fine. I mean, I've talked before about, there's actually a pinned comment in the Discord about people say, should I use MVC or how do I use MVC? And there's a bit of a rant there about the implications of that statement. I won't get into whether you should or shouldn't and when you should or shouldn't. That's a whole different conversation. I will say, though, by definition, model view controller is three concerns. Mm-hmm. It's literally split into a model, a view, and a controller. And something that was a bit of a red flag for me is if you scroll up to the top, you'll see line 567 mention model, the view, and the controller, which tells me this class knows about all three concerns, which kind of defeats the point of having a triplicate of individual concerns. So depending on your version of MVC or MVVM or MVP or whichever other separation model, there's a different level of interaction between each. So in this example, you should have, if you're using model view controller, the controller should be taking the data and interacting with it in such a way that it talks to the view. The fact that there's a class that understands all three layers means it is dealing with all three concerns, which is probably the wrong way to approach it. This might be okay if it was a composer object of some kind that was sort of like a composition root, but as a game controller, it shouldn't be dealing with each individual concern.
Yeah, that definitely popped out to you. You were the one who actually noticed this, the using of these namespaces, and that's actually a really good point. And seems like an interesting, maybe like a rule of thumb, like when you're scrolling through a code, especially one that's a class like this that's fairly large, you can kind of pop up to the top and kind of maybe catch some code smells like that.
That being said, I do appreciate the use of individual namespaces.
Yes,
always a good idea to use namespaces and separate your things out.
Yeah.
It just in a case like this, it'd be one thing if an individual controller talked to the view and the data, but this seems to be composing multiple controllers and views. which means it's probably doing too much work knowing about all those different parts.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a good point though. We mentioned this earlier that we saw code that we really liked and we skipped over it, but it's good to, it's good to look at the things we like. And yeah, namespacing is great because it does allow you to organize your code and define your boundaries better. And it actually kind of produces code smells like this. When you start pulling in a lot of namespaces, you got to think to yourself, like, what am I doing here? Why am I pulling in so many namespaces? Should this be separated so much? Should I have some other class to handle all this? So yeah, it's a good one.
Speaking of namespaces, personal thing I don't like. Yeah. Each to their own. I'm not going to say this is a particularly big deal. And there are reasons for it based on the Roslyn compiler. I don't want to go into stuff, but it's not technically necessary. And anytime you write a using statement, you are literally saying, this is a dependency this script has, and this code will function perfectly fine without that annotation and the implicit header.
That would be the used implicitly, which, I don't. This might be a resharper thing because Writer's not gonna care. Writer's gonna know that this is a Unity function, so this might be something that came from.
Well, it's to avoid those warnings, right? Where it's like it's not being used, and you're going to get those messages to say this isn't being called anywhere.
Yeah,
I understand why it's there. It's just I try to avoid having dependencies where possible. So
definitely.
It's annoying, but you can change the rules in Writer or ReSharper to basically ignore that.
Mm-hmm.
And it may seem like a bad idea to ignore an error, but when you're working with Unity, if that's the environment you're in, it's just a hazard of the job. I personally prefer to just have my code not warn me about that rather than actually have to annotate my code to mention that I'm using a particular editor or something like that, or a different compiler.
That said, we always say that, if you're on a team and that team has particular guidelines of how they want to work, you should always remain consistent. Yeah. So I'm on my own team here, so I'm going to get rid of this. Just because I don't know. I want to see the code as I would see it if I wrote it. All right.
Next up is another hotly contested topic we discussed on the Discord. Yep. People were there's a lot of arguments about that. And,
yeah, we had a good discussion about that the other day.
I really want to put a big note here, is if you came from a normal .NET background, your instinct is to throw exceptions. Now, exceptions, there's a whole topic. I could go on another big rant. I'm not going to. I will just say one thing as a shorthand. Exception, by its definition, are exceptional. They are a case where an edge case has occurred. They are things like trying to read a file, and the file doesn't exist. It's out of your control. The file system didn't work as expected. Or in the case of compile time exceptions or other exceptions which are actually problems with the code, they are costly. They are very costly to throw. And so in a good example of this, and this is probably a good example to show my own failings when I was younger. I was working in XNA, and I was building a grid system. So I was building a grid of tiles, and I basically you create what are called behaviors, and you'd iterate through different behaviors, and they all had a very Unity-like structure. So you had your start, your update loops, and so I did the usual thing. You initialize your grid of objects as a grid of a nested int array. And then you iterate through each of the ints, you draw a tile, and then you have a character move along the tile. So this was really early on. I was learning how to do programming for games. And when I hit the edge of my grid, you could get the index out of bounds exception, right? Because you're going to hit a point where I was checking the neighboring tiles to see enemies to attack them or whatever. And when I hit a tile on the far left or the far right of my game, there wouldn't be the neighboring tile. So when I was creating an array of the tiles around me, they didn't exist. So how do I handle this? Well, it's an exception as far as I'm concerned. So I would throw an exception because there isn't a tile there, and I would then catch the exception with a try block and say, no tile found. And I thought I was being clever. I was doing the right thing.
Yeah.
An exceptional case. And it amazed me, because it was brand new to this idea. I moved my character to the left of the screen and started walking down the side. And it didn't break because I had my try catch block, but it chugged. It was a tile, a single sprite, drawn on a single sprite, holding down on the input, and my game was just chugging along. And I was thinking, there's no processing here. How the hell is my game so slow? Because exceptions are really slow. They are not meant for that. Now, in a normal event-driven application, events are thrown when something goes wrong. They are thrown when a file isn't found. They are thrown when an API doesn't return the data expected. They are event driven and they are rare. You don't throw exceptions in something that can realistically have, especially update loops. Never throw an exception in update loop. That's just a given. You don't want something to happen there. But even in this case, even though it's only in awake, if this is the pattern you're following, exceptions are going to cause chugging. And even if you handle them, the whole point is you are literally throwing an exception. And exceptions are saying it broke. Something literally broke. This isn't an exception. This is a known expected case. It should be there, but it isn't there. That's not exceptional. That is a configuration problem, or it is an issue with building your application. So you could argue it might be fine if you're using these as guidance for yourself in the editor. But even then, I throw warnings personally, because I would default. So there's a term I like called batteries included, which means don't let your code get into a state where it'll break. Best case scenario, have a default implementation that doesn't do exactly what you want, but kind of works. In the case of no mouse controller, I would rather debug log a warning to say, couldn't find the mouse controller, I'm going to just have 0 input from the mouse. It's not ideal. Your application doesn't break. You still get the warning just like you would with the exception, and your app continues running on without any hitches or exceptions. So some of that's personal preference, but I will say if you literally read the guidelines from Microsoft, they will tell you, do not throw exceptions for known problems. If you can guess that a problem's going to occur, that doesn't qualify as an exception. It's only for things which are outside of your control, which could come back from a nebulous external space.
I'm trying to see if I can extract an interface from this and then kind of give an example of what you're talking about. So for instance, I think the only public thing here that gets used is this tile clicked event. Everything else is, we also have a public change mouse mode. So I'll do that, extract those, and then maybe current mode is public as well so people can check on it. So hit next. And then, so now we have this interface for mouse controller, and I could just create a public class null mouse controller that handles these things. So I mouse controller. Oop. I don't know why I'm not getting my IntelliSense on this. Okay. And here we could do something like debug.warn can't, this is a null mouse controller. So whatever you want to say. So then up here, now we can switch back to the game controller and we can say I mouse controller.
Yeah, exactly. And instead of saying it's null, say in the case where it's not there, we will assign it to a new instance of that mouse controller.
Yeah, and that's that whole concept of batteries included. Now this thing is not going to break your game. It's just not going to function the way you want it to. And I imagine it'll be very obvious when whoever's developing this turns it on and says, "Hey, what the heck's going on here?" And that's great because you're getting a lot. You're lowering that feedback loop. You know, with an exception, I think there is a little bit of a psychological thing that happens because an exception comes up, your console goes red, and you're like, "Oh, what could this be?" At least this is something that you've already planned for. So at least someone in the past, some version of you in the past was aware of this, and it makes it a little nicer to say that warning and say you might be like, "Oh, that's right, something's wrong. Maybe I created a new scene out of the game controller, but I forgot the mouse controller. Got it." And then you just added it.
I will say, so one thing for anybody who's curious, it wasn't arbitrary that Charles called it a null mouse controller. That is something called a null object pattern.
Yeah, it is a
worth
pattern.
looking into. It's basically a specific way of providing a default implementation that has no implementation.
You gave me ideas for two. Oh, sorry. Continue.
No, go for it.
I was gonna say you gave me an idea for 2 videos in this one stream, one with the exceptions and now one with the null pattern, because those are 2 things that have been coming up pretty frequently lately. But no, you seem like you had a good point.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say that it's a null object pattern. It's something to look into if you're curious. That the point about it is an implementation that has no implementation. It may sound weird to say, but it's basically saying null without, again, whole big rant I can go on to. Null isn't a concept really found in nature. It's not a thing that really makes sense. Normally, when you're referring to an item, it's in some state. It's not really such a thing as a null state. The classic, a glass is half full or empty or whatever, but it's never null. It's there. It's something. And so you can live your life by opening your, there's a glass on the table, and regardless of whether it's empty, full, half full, overflowing, doesn't matter. The world exists regardless. In a weird way, if you think about what null means, it means imagine the world breaks because the glass isn't there. Like, it doesn't make, you know what I mean? It's such an odd concept. So when you're designing systems that can talk to external systems, that in theory shouldn't break your code. So if there is no mouse input, the whole application shouldn't crumble. It should instead go, well, you didn't give me a mouse controller, so I just won't use the mouse. Yeah. It's not ideal, but it's not a critical error, and that's the defining difference. An exception literally is, oh my god, this game is about saving and reading files, and there's no files, there's no file system. I literally can't do what this application is for. That is an exception.
And it could be detrimental to the data. Like if you have data that's saving or in some weird state, like that exception could literally corrupt your game in the future, potentially. I mean, that's something that I've heard in the past, that like that you throw exceptions to stop your system, your game, or your application from getting into such a horrid state.
Like for example, if you've got a game which is in a broken state, and if someone tries to save the game, a good example of this is for all the Pokemon fans out there, Missing No, anyone who ever found the mysterious Pokemon, is one thing to have an issue where that occurs because someone gets a missing number, which, by the way, it took me way too long to figure out that's missing number. I was, as a kid, blew my mind. So it's one thing to get that Pokemon found, and it causes an incompatible state in the game, and it breaks things. But if you remember with the warnings when you were a kid, it's fine to catch him. Don't save the game with him in your party, because that's a difference, because the game is now in a critical state, and if you save it, you're saving exceptions into your code. So what a lot of people will do is they'll throw exceptions to say, this is unrecoverable. The game shouldn't, any data you save now is fundamentally broken. Don't do something wrong now, So use exceptions when you're kind of saying, that's it, we're done. We can't really recover from this problem. Or it's a third-party thing like a file system or an API. They're the only cases I really use those for. But one thing I did want to come back to, actually, the head back over there for one second.
I thought you were going to rant. I was going to do the rest of
this.
No,
that's literally something in the code here. One thing, we mentioned it before, but I just want to make a good point of this. One problem that you will get is, so we're using this null mouse controller as a way of saying there wasn't one provided. But how are you going to fix that normally? You're going to get a warning in the console. I like to give myself an easy way to change that if it's not what I wanted. So above that mouse controller line, I personally like to write warn, so just above line 27. We'll just do debug warning for now, just as a thing. So debug.log warning. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then say no mouse controller using right. You get a nice clean warning in the console. Yeah, and then afterwards do comma object or comma game object.
Yep, so you know where it came from.
You'll get a nice warning in the console.
You do object? I usually do this. Is there a difference?
Oh, do you? No. This will give you the actual script, but I just usually the object is fine. I did the game object rather.
Oh, yeah.
Literally either. Like it uses I think it uses component. So it doesn't matter. Anything that extends component will do.
I can't spell. Default.
So I do that, and that'll give me a warning in the console for everything that's not there, and then what I can do is click on it, it'll jump me to this, and then I can fix it, if that's my intention. But the counter to that is I also personally don't do the way you've done it in the null mouse controller myself, because that is technically an implementation. And if we're being pedantic to the version of the null object pattern, I don't like having implementation.
That's fair.
I can get there's also the very mild thing that debug log does have some mild overhead. Not much, not enough that it's ever really a warning, an issue to handle, but it's just something I try to be, aware of.
Gotcha. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, that makes sense to me. All right. Yeah, I like it. So I'm not going to bother doing the other ones for.
No. Yeah. Hopefully that gets the idea. And I will say as well, to follow my own advice I said earlier. In real terms, I wouldn't be using debug.log warning. I would be using warn, and I would have a function at the bottom called warning, which would do that for me.
Let's do it.
I suppose so. Why not?
Well, let me see if I can get fancy with writer. So we're going to do extract method, I think. Maybe method?
Isn't it surround as opposed to extract? I can't remember.
Surround would surround it with an actual
bracket. You can surround the method though, can't you? No?
I don't think so. I've never done it like that. Let me do refactor this. It'll probably come up with. Oh,
I usually do the control RM and it just extracts it to a method.
screw it. I'm just gonna make it. I'm just gonna do it by hand.
It's only a couple of words. Yeah.
Warren.
Now, that is a good point brought up in the chat. All of this is technically sort of a band-aid solution.
Mhm.
In super real terms, I would only do this. Well, actually, I do this a lot, but I do this a lot because the code I write tends to be consumable by artists on a team, and the less stuff they have to worry about hooking up, the better. And this plays into that batteries included concept I was talking about. Normally, what I do is I actually put another null check prior to the mouse controller, and I check if it's not already been provided, and I make it a public.
Oh, fair enough.
Private field serializable. It's getting really well. It can't be because it's
Well,
interface.
now, yeah, it's an interface.
But if it's not an interface, if it's something that is going to be provided as a field, I try to do that using the inspector as opposed to using this kind of pattern. Because if you do that, you are avoiding any actual calls. Like find object of type, I really hate using and will only use it whenever I really, really have to. Because again, think about what it's doing. It's literally walking through every single object in your hierarchy.
Yeah, I got you. Sorry, I'm like now I'm wondering why the hell this didn't work. Method, dude, I've done this a million times. Extract method. Okay, that worked. Warren. Oh, I messed that one up. All right, screw it. I'm not gonna belabor this. All right, so next one.
Yeah, so just to kind of bring all of that background, this is how I write code when it's going to be consumed by somebody who may not know how to hook every component up. If it's my own project, I will simply make the collaborators like this public. And that way I'll provide them rather than calling find object of type, and you have less calls to do throughout your code. So that's the summary. It depends on who's consuming your code, and people don't really realize that's a big deal. If you're writing code for yourself, you can avoid as many lookups and things as possible. I've even done some really cheeky stuff you probably shouldn't, where I will name objects, the actual GameObject.name, certain things, and I'll use GameObject.find to get them by name, like anchor point or something. Why? Because I know exactly what it's called, because I named it and I made it a child and I made it a prefab, and it's going to maintain that hierarchy. I've even done sometimes get child 0 because I know the first child is going to be a particular object.
Wow, yikes!
Is this
That reminds me of,
horrible?
like JavaScript days where I would do
Yeah.
things like that.
I'll admit this stuff does cause issues, but it's the difference between being earnest with yourself about what code is yours that no one else will touch versus stuff you're making consumable. So
Yeah.
this code we're writing here, I like the code I described there with get child. I would never hand to somebody because you'll get really weird invisible bugs where stuff isn't hooked up. Because we all know this, the metadata files will disappear in Unity from time to time, and you'll lose all of your hookups, and everything is suddenly broken, and everyone's confused. So don't use these really clever tricks or require dragging stuff in the inspector unless it's you doing it, because you will find issues where something will fail to update between two versions of Unity, and you'll be like, this has 7 different things injected into it, so I have to go and drag in 7 different controllers and search my hierarchy and find them all. So usually you have some manager that does all of that and does that for you. Failing that, this is a good solution if it's a companion script you give somebody else to consume.
Mhm.
So it's again different rules for building an asset for someone else versus building the base of a project that you're using yourself.
Yeah, and that's kind of that nuance we spoke about earlier. You have to write the code that you need, and if the code is going to be consumed by something else, then your code has different needs than if you're writing code for yourself.
Yeah.
So, all right, yeah, I'm not going to refactor all this.
Yeah. So the general idea is like, one, this wouldn't be needed in this small scope. Theoretically, you could just have 3 public fields and drag them in. If you were giving it to someone else to consume, I would follow that pattern we described there, where I would basically get the object, check if it's not null, get the object, do a warning if it's not there, provide a null implementation if it needs to be.
Well, to play devil's advocate for a second, would you ever do anything like this? Maybe like add component, and then add a turn controller?
I have done, but I find if I'm ever calling add component, it means it doesn't need to be a game object. And if that's the case, why am I using add component, and why isn't it just an interface as opposed to something based on mono behaviors?
Yeah. And then there's also the question of maybe this turn controller has some settings that need to be set in the editor. So,
and without getting to the finer point of that, if you do have settings and configurations, you can even split those out into a scriptable object and drag in the scriptable object that contains the settings rather than having them on an object that you need to kind of rely on. That way you don't have to worry about things like, if this gets reset or there's two instances, is the health field 100 in both of them, and it gets really confusing.
Yeah.
We're getting very nebulous, though. I don't want to cover, because we're kind of just talking around stuff, so let's get more practical to the code, because I don't know how valuable some of these sort of theories are for people. So
Yeah. So something we talked about was there's a lot of object composition here in the start method. For instance, we're creating a new controller, and then we're passing in a new adventure, and then we're passing in what seems to be, I don't think this is a singleton. No, it looks like just a static method that gets adventure 1. So yeah, a lot of object composition here. Like maybe there's a better way to inject these. For instance, create your own composite root, some class that is aware of game controller and can actually build these objects itself and hand them into the game controller, inject them into the game controller, as opposed to having all of this logic in here that is building out its own dependencies, which could lead to issues later on if you have to make changes.
So the kind of a fancy way of describing this is to say this is showing how the sausage is made. And at the end of the day, as far as this script is concerned, it needs an adventure controller. That's all it needs.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to know what an adventure controller really is contained, what it has, what's in it, how all that stuff works. You could theoretically have an adventure controller passed into this, or you could have an adventure controller factory. And I know people are going, oh my god, you're already massively over-engineered. Not really. If I had adventure controller factory dot create, that's one line. It doesn't make this any more complicated. In fact, it removes all of this complexity, and this script only cares about one dependency, the thing that gives it an adventure controller. So it may look like you're just moving the problem. You're still doing all of that stuff, and that's technically what you are doing. You're moving the problem. Why? Because that's not this guy's job. You're allowed to move the problem. That's kind of the point. You can then decide later how to make an efficient adventure controller, as long as this guy is able to query for one without writing all of it in here. So it's a very small little change, but if you just wrote, get me adventure controller somehow, I don't care, do a thing, then this whole chunk of code can be figured out later. Because ask yourself what the job of this script is, and in this case, it's not to construct an adventure controller.
Oh, we could kind of do what you said earlier and kind of just, at least for now, move it out of the way.
Yeah, even that is kind of good. And this is the other thing too, right? When we're talking about refactoring, a big complaint I see people say is, you're building these massive over-engineered, nested this, and this, and this. Well, when you're refactoring, you don't refactor to a perfect solution. You refactor to a better solution. So in this case, moving out to a function like this is already removing one step, right? So you don't need to get to the right answer immediately. You can do these small fixes that make things a little bit nicer, a little bit cleaner.
Yeah.
And once you do this, you'll start to actually see, hang on a second, if I'm able to move this out into a different dependency, should it even be here in the first place? The fact that it's got a different name, get adventure controller, ask yourself, would that be a public function on the interface that is this script? And probably not, right? Because it's not something that is the job of this object. So little abstractions like this will help you sort of get to the root of what each script is supposed to do.
Yeah. And even this is not ideal, but yeah, like what you said, and I think this is an important thing that people miss the point on, is that you're trying to move your code towards a better place. It doesn't always have to be perfect. And I get from experience why you get caught up in that, because you figure, well, I'm writing this, I'm in control of this. Why wouldn't I take the time to make this perfect? But then you go down the rabbit hole. You don't really know all the future needs of a particular class or script. So don't worry about getting it perfect. Just worry about making it readable and changeable, flexible.
And that's like what I said earlier, right? It's like I will use singletons in some cases like this, which sound like an anti-pattern, but I'll do it because I've already done the hard work, which I've moved the code out. So if you think about it, like I said, somebody, Unity gods, give me an adventure controller. Like, that's the statement you're making. I don't care how you do it. I don't care what crazy find object of type or get component or instantiate a scriptable object. I don't care. Just do something and get me this object so I can continue doing my job. And so when people are worried about you getting too granular with stuff, it comes back to the same thing we discussed earlier, which is don't do it. Don't do the things you don't need to do. We're doing this to remove the problem out because we shouldn't be thinking about creating this while we're doing the rest of this code. We're not going to go down and make a 6-layered factory and do all the stuff because that's not what we need to do right now. We need to make this start function say what it's doing. And right now, it's saying a lot of information. It's telling me how an adventure controller is built and what's in it and all the different parts of it. And I don't need to know that information.
Real quick before we move on, we got a super chat from In and Out. It's for you, Jason. He asked, does Jason have his own YouTube channel? I can kind of answer that. He does. He's not actively posting to it, but he has a lot of great playlists on there that have very informative courses and videos about development. I don't know if you want to talk anything more about that, but I know that's kind of the state of your channel right now.
Yeah, it's the state, all right. So combination of between not having a lot of time and also just really hating producing YouTube videos. I've tried on numerous occasions. It just doesn't seem to be for me. But I have decided that I get a lot of common questions, and there's a lot of really good resources out there that aren't me, that answer questions that I don't want to, that there's no need for me to go and make a video about when there's other people who've done really good jobs on. So if you do go to my channel, and it is just my name, Jason Story, you will find a load of playlists. And I consider my YouTube channel as a hub to host other people's great content. So if you head to the playlist section on my channel, there'll be a whole load of sections on everything from really useful information about film theory all the way up to game design practices to very explicit things about color theory and programming and some of the really good Unite and GDC talks. So treat my YouTube channel as a great way to find other good resources.
See, that's not the attitude of a YouTuber, man. Yeah, you said that there's plenty of good resources out there, so why should I recreate it? A good YouTuber would say, I'm going to recreate it because it's going to be mine.
Well, I'll put it this way. I don't think this content is currently on YouTube, so this needs to be made. But we don't need another person to describe how, how to write debug logs again. There's
challenge
you've done
accepted.
I don't need to do it as well. I can just point to you and say, Charles has done a good video on it.
Someone asked also, can I submit code using a GitHub link? You can. One thing that I need to adjust on my code submission form is that I need to add a notes field because if you're gonna upload like a GitHub project, it's gonna be more valuable for us if you just point us in the direction of where we should be looking to review, like what particular controller or class or whatever the case may be. So go ahead and you can submit that code, and I'm gonna add a notes field so that anyone who submits code could add some notes about where they want us to look. But in the meantime, what you can do is you can just put the repository, and then you can add additional links. Just add another link that is a link to the direct file that you want us to look at. So that could be a good start. All right. So yeah, we fixed that. I think as far as object composition or creation.
Yeah, we won't keep going through the same hierarchy again, but the general idea is this is doing about 4 things. Separately from the actual calls, it is instantiating objects and it is configuring objects. And realistically, it needs to do 3 things. It needs to say, get me a map, related information, get me the adventure stuff, and then start. That's it. And so a lot of the stuff that's going on here could be relegated to somebody else's job and configured in different ways to create all sorts of different cool maps and different cool stuff. And this script should be exactly the same.
Yeah. Cool. All right, next up, I know you pointed this out too. There's this trigger event function that takes a string.
Magic strings.
Yeah, magic strings. So it basically, the adventure controller has a trigger event function that takes the string, and I assume that I'm no expert, but it triggers some sort of event. But it's using this. Yes. So it's using this magic string. What do we do with those magic strings?
So the simple naive answer would be for someone to say, make an enum. And I've gone on a rant before where I've said, don't do that. Because an enum is a defined list of things that shouldn't have to change. This isn't an enum because realistically there'll be many, many events that may need to change. So we need to find a way to put in something in here that can be triggered that is statically typed, but also changeable.
Mhm.
And so the quick and dirty answer is make a constant string or something.
Yeah.
Just a nice, simple constant string. And for people who don't know, constant strings literally, when compiled, turn into the value, which it may sound obvious, but it's not the same thing as a variable. If you have a variable, the variable will be placed in memory and it'll reference it across the different parts. If you make a constant string, literally, if you open and decompile the code, it will have the value of the string in it in all those places, which means there's no lookup, there's no reference resource or anything. It's just that is literally what the value is. So there's that. And then as you start to get more robust with this and you do lots more stuff, you can automate this process. So what you can do is you could create a file that contains all of these as a single one and manages all of your different tags. Then you could even do things like literally convert the tags into an automatic script by using some sort of, using the activator or something else.
I think I might actually do that because I think it's probably checked in the adventure controller. It probably has to check the same string. So if we go to the other side of this whole thing, let me find where that adventure controller was. It was trigger event. Okay, so it contains a set of triggers.
Also,
I'm getting triggered right now.
Yeah, that every time you trigger, there could be null exceptions, which are going to cause judders every time that hits.
Well, I'm sorry. We don't need to go this deep. I just thought I thought he was going to have some sort of if or switch in there that was checking strings that I could use it as an example. But all right, never mind. Don't worry about that. Oh, Control Alt D is introduce field. Cool. My problem. I'm usually really good at becoming a power user at programs, but I constantly switch from Visual Studio with ReSharper to IntelliJ, which is the Java version of Writer. It actually came before Writer, and then to Writer. And I've tried to set it up to where they all have the same mapping, but
they even have an IntelliJ setting for Writer, but it doesn't do everything the same.
It doesn't do everything the same. So what I really need to do, I don't know what I really need to do. I guess it's just what I've resulted to is I'll just do double shift and I'll just type the thing. Like if I want to make a new class, or I just do new, or like you've seen me do rename, or I think you can even just type in refactor this. So I got to learn them all, but I just keep switching.
Had whatever it is, 15 years or 12 years of working with Visual Studio. It's going to be, I'm still only like 6 months into using Writer or so maybe a year. It's hard to tell. But either way, not long enough to have unlearned all of the shortcuts that I used to know. Yeah. So every so often I still find myself going, Control RM or Control RR or RC or Control MO I used to love, but that doesn't work anymore. That's closing all the regions. There's just so many little shortcuts.
You know what screwed me up too? I got a 10 keyless keyboard and it doesn't have insert. It doesn't have any F function keys, the F1 through F12 or whatever. It's missing a whole bunch of the keys that I used to love using. Like it's tight. It's I love that, but God, I miss those keys.
Yeah, mine doesn't have those either. But I've never really been a fan. I use a nice 10 keyless as well.
I miss like insert. I would use insert a lot. And I use a program called Total Commander for file navigation in Windows, and it leverages a lot of the F keys. So that's why I liked it. But yeah, I don't know. I'm like
Sean brings up something that we looked at ourselves. So
thanks for the super chat, Sean. You call out a really good one.
This one is very interesting, and I had to look this up because I wasn't entirely sure. Now, for those who don't know, these on functions are, we call them magic functions in Unity. They're basically, Unity has a bunch of keyword named functions that will call kind of on collision enter or on trigger enter that basically, for every mono behavior, it'll iterate through all the scripts, find anything, even if it's private, that has those names, and then we'll add it to a list and we'll call them at the appropriate times. So both on destroy and on application quit are Unity specific functions. Unity will call these magically at some point when it needs to do what it needs to do. And if you look at actually, it might be worth pulling it up, Charles. Look at the lifecycle, the Unity application lifecycle.
Yeah, let me see if I can find it. It's like a nice graphic, right?
It's on the Unity page. There's a nice graphic for it. Yeah.
Pull that up. See if this is it. There he is.
Here it is. So this is the life cycle of magic functions in Unity. And this comes back to what we were saying before. All of these are called in order as you see them during the life cycle of your application per mono behavior. So it's worth noting that every awake will be called before the first start function. And then, as it says here, starts only ever called once per given script. And you can kind of go through this and see what each individual one does. Some of them only work on certain things. For example, on state machine enter only gets called if the script is on the state machine. Similarly with some of these other ones, they only on trigger enter or on collision enter will only get called if there is a collider which has the appropriate rigid body collisions, similar, all these kinds of stuff. I don't want to focus on those too much, but I do want to focus on, if you go all the way to the bottom, decommissioning. There are 3 functions here. On application quit, then on disable, then on destroy. So, in theory, it should call all 3 functions. And so you shouldn't have to reference one to the other. And in fact, it might cause some issues where you're calling an automated function inside another function. But I was really curious about this, and I still don't know the answer. I probably should have checked it before this stream, but I haven't gotten around to it. There is a good chance, from some of the research I've done, that an application that is quit explicitly, say you Alt F4, it may quit, but not call on destroy on the individual game object, because the application has quit prior to doing an iterative destroy of all of the objects in the scene. So there might be technically merit to calling destroy on quit.
As
I don't
awful
think
as
there
it
is. I don't think that's supposed to work. And even if it is, you shouldn't have on destroy called in on application quit. I would recommend having your own named function dispose of resources and call that in both if that's the goal. Because then you're not going to worry about a magic function calling another magic function. But if anybody knows that, I would be delighted to find out, because I'm not sure. I think there are cases where on application quit will get called, but on destroy will not, if it's literally the end life cycle of your application. Now, all that being said, do I recommend you do this pattern? Probably not. There's probably not a case where this has to happen. Like, realistically, you can be fairly safe your application will get disposed of correctly from on destroy. If it doesn't, well, I guess Windows will eventually deal with the memory at some point. I guess you're being a good citizen by doing it this way.
Yeah, right.
But I don't like it. It seems icky. I'll put it that way. It just doesn't seem like something you're supposed to do.
Yeah. I think there's something like I was reading also trying to figure out what the right path is, and there was something like is application quit or something like that. I don't know. Whatever.
Is playing the one is you can actually set is playing defaults and it will call quit.
Oh yeah! Wow, that's funny. That's
weird.
Interesting.
You set a property setter to quit or to false, and it will quit the application. Not an expected behavior. I don't like that.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, that pretty much covers that. That was kind of a big one we saw.
Yeah.
I guess the only other one that I would probably bring up now. Remember it was like the law of Demeter that we saw getting
it's the
getting
perfect
abused.
example right there.
Yeah.
So, law of Demeter is you should I forgot the exact definition. It's basically like you should know about your friends and not your neighbors or something. I forgot that there's like a fancy name for it. Either way, the actual principle is you only need to know about the things you're calling. So, for example, current controller interacts with the current player. But right now, there's secretly an awful lot of information being leaked by this line of code, which, without even thinking about it, we're able to say, we know that a turn controller exists. A turn controller uses a player via using a character to update movement using this information. So there's so much information leaked there, where if you decide to change it and turn the current player into a car, which, for whatever reason, you can't do that because you're exposing the fact that it's using this character object. If you decide to change how character is implemented, you can't do that because you've leaked that knowledge to everybody else. So realistically, this class should be updating movement. So you should say current controller dot update movement and maybe pass in a player, or just leave it to him to figure out whoever the current player is. Either way, you shouldn't be passing children of children through your application.
I'm trying to do this real quick. Update player movement.
Yeah, and we'll do a quick and dirty one. There's other ways I'd do it, but I'd say just do it. Just even that's perfectly fine, and just take in the tile information.
Yeah, and then so what was it? X,
Just
Y, X, Y, and tile.
I usually just F12 into it and then copy the contract for the function.
That's way smarter than what I was doing. Making me nervous, guys.
Never judge a program or programming live, guys. Unless you try to it's a very stressful experience.
What's happening here? All right.
There's a reason why I get to sit here calmly and let Charles do all the work, because I don't have to panic. So now basically we can simplify all of this by clearing both of those words.
Boom. I think I called it update character or player movement or something. I've come up with a better name, but yeah. Oh, it expects a return value?
Oh yeah. Also, that's it. Like we'll actually get to that in a second.
Oh, boy. For now, I'm just gonna return. Yeah. I'm sure I could just call the thing, but just for the sake of me.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, fine. We'll just.
I'll do it later. Yeah, well, you get the idea.
So that's one thing. So now we've basically removed one layer of knowledge from two scripts, which means it may seem like the same thing. It may be subtly. But hang on a second. Should the turn controller handle player movement? Well, yeah, that's what he's doing, right? He's controlling the turns. You could theoretically call turn controller dot update movement and pass in a player. That's another option if you wanted to do it that route. But either way, the point is you shouldn't be exposing how turn controller does his job. There's no point in making a class called turn controller to do the turn controller work if you're going to leak how he does his job anyway. The point of that abstraction is to say, I don't want to deal with the implications of how this works. I just want to let someone else do this job. And so if you're ever calling dot something, you're giving away how everything's made, and you should have a function that just is something dot do something.
Well, it goes update path. So I was going to do the same thing because this other line breaks the log demeter as well. So yeah, same idea. We're going to take this code and we'll drop it in there, and that way you're just saying, hey, I'm updating the player movement and I'm updating the path.
And even separately, it just makes things smaller. Like you can do the same thing because that's actually the same function. You look at line 145. Like you've already written it. That's the update player. Right.
Oh,
you can see how this is sort of
I get you.
Simplifying stuff.
Yeah.
Now, one other thing as well brings up a good point because you caught us both off guard there. We didn't realize it returned a Boolean because there is a general idea of side effects when you're writing functions, and it basically boils down to how do I phrase this? So it's commonly applied in databases, and it's called command query separation. And effectively, it means functions do two things. You're either getting information or you're executing some command. In this case, you are doing a command, updating the player movement, and then you're potentially getting information back. So this is giving us back true or false. But that doesn't tell us anything. That says, so for example, if I get true back from update player movement, is that telling me the player movement happened? The player was able to move? The player moved to the appropriate tile? Or is it that player movement was received but decided not to move? That true doesn't tell me anything. It just tells me, okay, true, good, for some reason. And if I get false back, does that mean there was an error in moving? Does it mean that I wasn't allowed to move this frame? That's not any information. So usually you would split that up into your command and your query. Your command would be update player movement, and in the next line you might say if player at tile position. That way you check, did you do the move? Check if the move was successful. They're two separate entire concerns, and it's logically confusing to return a Boolean from a function that doesn't have some clear distinction of being a query. And a good indicator of this is if you can't write is in front of your method name, you probably shouldn't be returning a Boolean from it. So is update player movement doesn't make any sense, does it? But is at correct tile, is arriving at destination, is able to move, these are all Boolean checks. They are your queries, they are not your command.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we just saw live how confusing that was. So, yeah. So another thing, well, I think the one last thing we can take a look at real quick is, well, it's so silly, but this enum that's nullable.
Nullable enum.
Why?
Okay. Most of this stuff is okay. I'm fine with a lot of it. This is just sort of like, don't take any personal problem to this. These are all just, tweaks and stuff. This is horrible. Nobody should ever do this. If something is, and this goes for the int above as well.
Yeah.
We could go on a whole big rant about value types and reference types, and I won't, because that's actually a whole video that Charles can make someday. But
Taking notes.
yeah, but I will say, the reason you use something like an enum is to define a distinct collection of steps that can happen in relation to something. In this case, directions, which, without even looking at it, it tells me, left, right, up, down. Great, I can guess what that is. Maybe it's north, south, east, west, but I can tell it's going to be 4 directions. That's going to be very clear to me. The question mark is using a nullable object to tell me that it's also null is a state. But here's the thing. The point of a directions object is to have 4 distinct states. You're adding one on top of it, that's confusing everything. So if in the case of this particular application, none is a viable state to be in, then none should be one of the states. None, left, right, up, and down. Now, should that be done in this case? I don't think so, because directions are a very discrete set. I would so southwest, north, and east. There we go. Not even the right order. Right.
I was just gonna say. Hold on, let me. North. How would you want to do it? North, south, east, west?
South, east, west. Yeah, the same way, Charles. Of course.
I just want to make sure we both agree on what is sane. That's funny.
But either way, so it's fine. You can do it this way.
Hey, he does it over here.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
That's perfect. Yeah.
None case. I understand why though, because it sounds very clean to go directions north, south, east, west.
Yeah.
None is not a direction. That's silliness. I wouldn't do that. Well, the unfortunate thing is your code requires it. It's actually more sensible to have a non-direction in the use case you've got than it is not to. What I would probably do in a real scenario is this is called like move directions or something. I wouldn't try to because you'll find a lot of developers do this. They will write something like directions as I can use this in any case I'll ever need a direction ever. Well, the real world doesn't work that cleanly. Oftentimes you would have move directions may be different from turn directions. They sound the same, but the requirements and use cases could be different. So I have no problem writing move or turn direction, and that would be something which has none in it. It's not a catch-all every time I ever need left, right, up, down. It is more directions that I need for this problem that I'm solving.
Right, because there's a difference between saying these are cardinal directions, which are definitively north, south, east, west. There's no other option. And then you have movement, player movement direction or player direction. That's where you can say, well, there is a case where he could be in no direction at this current state. He's not going anywhere. So yeah, I like that you said that, because I think that's one thing that maybe an abuse of dry, where people really like, I already have movement. I got movement, or I already have directions. Like I got to use them for everything. You're like, no, man, you can break it up.
Just to say, this isn't picking on anybody, because here's an example I have done and kicked myself for. I was really smart one day and I made something called axes. And I did X, Y, and Z, and I thought I've got the ultimate axes. Every time I ever need to talk about axes, whether it's custom inspectors or whether it's my own code or I'm doing a grid or I'm rotating object on pivots, I've got the axes enum. It'll work it doesn't work like that. There are cases where I only needed 2 of them. There are cases where I wanted to be flags and I could have 2 axes simultaneously. There are cases where I didn't want to have to reference a namespace from an entirely different system just because I wanted to reference the single thing. So you move it out to a commonality library or something. Now you're bringing in axes and the stuff that doesn't need it. It's a mess. If you need axes of movement or axes of rotation, make rotation axes or something. Like do the thing that you need for the job you are doing.
Yep.
All of that being said, there is one thing I do want to point out, which is there's actually a bigger problem with this than the kind of just general annoyance of using null, which is I design with that question mark, and there's also one above for current index with a question mark. They are both telling me there is an invalid state this application can be in. Now, here's the thing. We'd understand from reading this code that all this really means is uninitialized. That's what that really, really means. Because there should never be a case going forward for this application where you're not using a direction or not on a particular current tile. So at least my guess of what this application is doing is that's meant to represent I have yet to have assigned the first value to this object. And sometimes you'll find that case where you're like, well, it's default null at the start. I have to figure out what to do. I'd be very wary of that. If you start tracking through your code the concept of this might not be initialized yet as an actual state of your application, there's a problem. Take a pause and ask yourself, can you just assign a default state before the application starts? If, for example, your character always needs to be a tile on a grid, throw an exception if the grid doesn't exist, but always put them on some tile. Don't let no tile set yet be a state that trickles through your application until you decide to put them down, because your application is now allowed by your design to be in an invalid and broken state. That will lead to all sorts of chaos. You're far better off to just say, you know what, I'll just put you somewhere. And you'll see this in some games, where even in professional AAA titles, if you do something weird where you start messing with player values and stuff, the game will just go, you know what, they should be somewhere, I'll just snap them to the first tile I can find. Because there's stuff that just should never happen. And if it is about to happen in your code, make a best guess and put it somewhere. So what I mean by that is all of this kind of nullable types, you're adding null to a situation which doesn't need null. And null is literally a black hole of breakness that'll break your code some point. You don't want to add those at various points where something randomly could be null. Instead, if it may not be the ideal scenario, but you're better off with null objects or with assigning some value just so your application works. And that's why you get these weird things like the Assassin's Creed bugs where characters look wonky and stuff, because they would rather have the game try and run where cases where it's not critical. And this comes back to what we're saying about exceptions. There's a fundamental difference between an exception that is fatal, that will break your application and you don't want to propagate bad state, versus stuff that might look a bit silly or wonky or whatever. So if you can recover from weird scenarios, do your best to do that. And a good example of this is at the start of your application, sometimes values need to be assigned that are not there. Don't propagate no value has been assigned. Just assign something. Assign your default grid position to 0. Assign your default index of your array to the first one. If there's no indexes in the array, then assign a new empty object or something. If it makes sense, just keep your application in a comfortable state and don't let null be an actual feature that you provide in your application. It'll just lead to untold errors.
Yeah. That was good. I wonder if
I didn't know I would have. That just came top of my head.
I wonder if they should have thrown an exception for that heavy rain bug. You know, Sean, like maybe they should have had a counter. Like, all right, we're just gonna crash this thing. We have not recovered. Cool. Someone asked how you can get your code reviewed. Just to answer that question real quick, there's a link in the description of this video, infalliblecode.com/code-review. You can submit your code there, and we will try our best to get to it soon. We stream every week. Is there anything you wanted to go into, or are we at a good stopping point, Jason?
I think we're good. I just want to say one thing about this code in particular.
We never got to the state machine.
Yeah, it's fine. Just, either way, like I want to point out here, Gleb knows what he's doing. Like, there's a lot of clever nods here that implies to me that he knows what. Like, for example, there is dependency inversion, which implies the understanding of separation of concerns. Even little subtle things like using the params keyword implies to me an understanding of some of the syntactical sugar of C#. This isn't bad code by any measure. It's actually really well written. It has a lot of good stuff. There's just a few things which are, for lack of a better word, I don't know. I call it classical training. If you come from a background where you've done C# before game development, or you got really into C# as a language separate from game development, you'll find yourself bringing in patterns from other disciplines. And that really speaks to me from this code that I have a very strong guess he's written other stuff in the past, because your first instinct as a designer for a game isn't MVC. MVC is something that comes from a background in doing web development or WinForm development or something. And because of that, there's a lot of things here which are put in because they're comfortable. Because I use these in other systems, I know how they work, this will apply here, and games don't work like that. And I did this myself for years. I tried to fight Unity and say, how can I make Unity look like the clean, fancy, structured code that I'm used to from my event-driven, line of business software? And the truth of the matter is your concerns are vastly different. There's no point in just applying things that you are aware of or like or features from other different environments. It's better off looking at the implications of the stuff you're writing for the environment you're in. And so a lot of the code here is well written and perfectly fine in the context of an event-driven desktop application. But in the context of a game, some of these should be reevaluated. Now, again, it's event-driven game, so you can kind of give a bit of leeway there, more so than usual, because the update loop isn't as critical. But the point is still there, that some of this design speaks to me of a event application and not an update loop-based application. So it's just worth keeping in mind. Don't try to throw disciplines in you're familiar with from other environments. Ask yourself why that was designed. MVC was designed because in common applications, there is usually a different database source from the different UI platforms. So you use MVC because you will use the same app on Linux and Windows. Both UIs will change, and then you might change your backend to be one client's database versus another client database. MVC serves a very critical purpose for a design for a line of business piece of software. An application like this, are you going to be changing the entire UI framework? Are you going to be changing the entire backend source? Are you going to be really changing your business logic? Does that separation need to exist? And if it does, ask yourself how you can draw the lines to maximize the simplicity for rewriting certain things. So I would just say nothing about this is bad code. It is just code that's misapplied to the problem that you're solving.
I wholeheartedly agree. Thank you, Gleb, for submitting this code. This is great.